Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second interview of Finding Me today on the ITV networks with my very special guest Siseko Khumalo. And we're speaking about violence, femicide, gender-based violence, state violence. Before last week's interview, there was much to consider in the South African scenario in terms of the issues that were being raised, about rape, the rape of women, rape of children. We saw the state act out violently towards certain of its citizens, and the question was, are these citizens or are they subjects? And there was the big issue right from the start of the lockdown about the whole problem of domestic violence, an increase in gender-based and domestic violence with the lockdown. These are serious issues. There's something drastically wrong with our society, with us as individuals, and we have to start taking note and we have to start asking the questions so that we can bring about changes. And with me to discuss all of this is Siseko. So once again, thank you, Siseko, for making this time.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's actually very scary. As surreal as the COVID-19 scenario is, if one looks at this whole scenario of violence, which was in normal circumstances, and then it's just exacerbated in the abnormal circumstances, one has to ask, is that circumstance actually normal? Is this kind of violence, which was an everyday occurrence of our lives, so that it had to be figured into the policy making decisions in an abnormal environment, is it really normal? I mean, like as you said right at the start, people are waiting to go back to normal, but the normal that I know is horrendous. It's horrible. Yeah, in of itself. And so I definitely don't want to go back to a normal post-COVID-19. I'm hoping for something new, a complete shift and break away from the normal. I keep telling people that I meet, don't wish for the normal. Don't ask to go back to that. That life was not good. That way was not good. I mean, the whole world was crying out. If you look at nature, how did 2019 end and 2020 begin with the fires?
In Australia.
Yeah, in Australia, but all over the world. Prior to that, there were fires everywhere. The oceans were gone crazy. The animals were suffering. We've seen an extension of the abuse that man has wreaked upon everything, whether it is on our own beings, on those that are closest to us and whom we love, in terms of our environment, in the way we treat animals. Even just basic respect seems to have gone out of the door, which is what you were speaking about, the black artist speaking about fear of being gripped by fear of the children, because it's a dismantling of respect, and respect, you don't give people respect, you don't give anything, it's earned. But if we have forgotten to appreciate goodness, how can we then even begin to understand respect?
So Quraysha, I want to say three things, and I'll try and be as brief as possible because there's so much to be discussed. But the first one for me is the question of how and when did we lose our values, right? As society, as our communities, and what has been the effect and the aftermath of us losing our values, right? So if we think about these issues in very pragmatic ways, right? In many instances, our people have been consumed by a consumerist culture that is gluttonous, that in many respects is very possessive, right? So, and again, where did we get these values from? We got these values from our own ideas around, for instance, land tenure being scrapped and being put to the side to say, if you don't have a title deed to this land is not yours, right? That's where it all begins. It begins with all of the ways in which our conceptions of how it is that we treat one another were corrupted in many respects in this country as per the inception of colonialism. So that's the first thing, right? Our values have been corrupted, and today we are bearing the brunt of the corruption of those values. In the second sense, with respect to the environmental challenges, again, right? It goes back to the question of values. But in many respects, as you say, post-COVID-19, we don't want to go back to the normal. I suggest that in many instances, a lot of the people who are calling for a return to the normal are people whose lives were not really that affected, right, by the situation of what society was, right? Because they live behind their high walls with their private security companies and dogs that patrol their yards on a daily basis, right? So it tells you what particular individual wants a normal, right? Who exactly is this person that wants a normal? And the final thing that I want to touch on is the question of leadership, right? In respect to, and of course this is going to be, it's contentious, and you know, as an academic, I'm intrigued by how certain claims are contentious within society, but it points to the fact that in the South African context, we have been without leadership and continue to be without leadership, both at a national level in terms of our government, in terms of our local communities, in many respects because of the ways in which our values have been inverted. Our local communities are now leaderless in the sense of we no longer pay due respect to our community elders, to our church leaders, to our mosque leaders. We're no longer giving our elders that space or that place of reverence within our society, and that corrupts in many instances the very core of our communities, as it were. And again, it starts right at the top, right? It starts right at the top, whereby we have sold out on our values, and we want the land, we want the 18 million rand, buck or whatever it was that was being on auction,
bull,
all of those, all of those many years ago. Because we want to ascribe our value and our humanity with relation to our possessions. And that was never our society's.
It's all about wants, and it's not only about needs anymore.
Absolutely. And that was never our societies back in history. Our societies were never about who has. Our societies were always about living a dignified life and making sure that everybody within society is taken care of. So you wouldn't have this big man within society. You would have a society that cares for its members and its community.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, leadership is the huge issue, but it's leadership in the home, then in the community, and then in this broader society at last, then locally, and then, of course, internationally. I mean, internationally, we're dealing with, I think, a bunch of gangsters who are leading the states of the world, the international states. And all of this, it comes, again, a question comes to mind that with so much violence in the world, with each other, towards each other, we have to ask ourselves that, you know, how are we going to reimagine the society in which we will find ourselves post-COVID-19? But more than that, you were explaining to me that there are so many dimensions to this violence and this femicide, and as a result of all of this, you have also broken up your seminar and your conference, which was supposed to happen intuitively and interactively between people. It now has to become a virtual seminar, but the conversation has to go on. So tell us a little bit about this break.
So the initial dates of the symposium were the 19th and 20th of May, which of course has long passed. And what we've decided to do is that we've decided, instead of having a concentrated 1 day or 2 day event, to have a series of about 4 webinars that we're going to host virtually. And each and every single one of them considers a different dimension or a different facet of gender-based violence in the country. So for instance, we begin by defining and sort of surfacing some of the contestations around the notion of femicide. So the concept, while it is being used in popular media and in popular discourse, is a contested concept, right? So a lot of people, some people would suggest that no, what we're seeing is not femicide, right? Because femicide also means that this is a violence that is specifically targeted against women and a genocide against women, right? Some colleagues would suggest that a genocide, in terms of a legalistic framework, a genocide is state-sponsored violence or politically sponsored violence. And they would suggest that at the moment we don't see state actors or political actors influencing this narrative of we must, or this killing against women. So that's the first one. It basically talks to some of those ideas around what that would mean to have a definition of this idea of femicide. And what are the contestations in many respects. We then move on in the second webinar to consider the question of mourning, specifically victims of this femicide, right? So for instance, if you think about the case of what happened in the case of Uyinene Mrwetyana as well as Kensani Maseko, Cameras, for instance, went as far as to go into the home of Uyinene Mrwetyana as the president was visiting the family to pay his respects and his condolences. And I wonder around when, as we stand in solidarity with the family members of those who have been, who have been affected by femicide, how much room do we give to that family to conduct their rituals in terms of the internment of the dead, right? Giving them, because in many instances it's a double invasion. It's an invasion in the sense of the person who has been killed. It's an invasion in terms of the court case that plays itself out.
Yes,
Still.
so your whole life
Yes.
becomes public again.
Absolutely. In the third seminar, or in the third webinar rather, we then look at the art of violent men, right? Specifically as the Javits UP Art Center, it still had it recently took down Zwelithini Mthethwa's work, right? Zwelithini Mthethwa, who was convicted in 2017 of murdering a sex worker. And the question was that particular painting erupted a massive conversation in the South African context to say, how do we continue to exhibit in national galleries, in institutional galleries, work of people that we know have been convicted of murder?
I just want to hold you there for two thoughts. Okay, so I know you have a lot to say, but I'm going to lose these thoughts.
Yeah.
And the first one was when you spoke about the whole concept of mourning. It just brought me to a realization now of COVID-19. And for example, the Muslim community, our deaths are always very social, very community orientated and very big. So when somebody passes on, the whole community visits. But now with COVID-19, a close family member who passed on, and of course we couldn't attend the funeral. And for the first time we were talking amongst ourselves, just the family members and ourselves, about what it meant. And despite the fact that the community could not come, everybody who was basically confined to the home said that it actually gave them an opportunity to really mourn and to spend time with their close ones and the loved ones without worrying about making food or seeing who came, or making sure that everybody is sorted, and all of those things that come together with large gatherings. Also to deal with the excessive noise, misbehavior, people talking, disrespect for the dead, others. We have big issues, I won't lie. I'm not going to sweep this under the carpet, especially in Muslim funerals also, where we feel aunties yapping away, uncles yapping away. There isn't this prayer going on, which should be showing, a sense of respect to the deceased and to the deceased family, the opportunity to mourn. And somehow there was so much more dignity. Although you lost someone you loved and lots of people who love you could not be present, but the opportunity to embrace that mourning was very much more powerful. So that's the first thing that I want to bring quickly to this conversation. And before I come to the second point, we have to go to a break. Unfortunately, we're still caught by the capitalists, so we have to get some revenue. But we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment of the second interview today with Siseko. And before we went on to the break, Siseko had raised some interesting observations to which I rudely interjected because I have to say something. And Siseko, I want to come to the second point. And as you were speaking about this, where you said that this particular artist, whose painting was up, and there was a big argument, well, not an argument, but a big debate was raised in the university sector, says, can you keep his painting up when he's been convicted of sex work, etc. So in other words, can you continue to valorize or appreciate or entertain somebody who has a problematic character or behavior? Didn't this make you think about Rhodes Must Fall? Because
Yeah.
all of these statues that have been, and not only Rhodes Must Fall, but in our society, in our community, the broader South Africa, where we have all of these displays of so-called people who might be philanthropists, as Rhodes was, or might be great commanders or generals, as some of these apartheid figurines were. And so we keep them to valorize that goodness in their character, but or in their response to what they're contributing but then we forget about the character flaw or the problematic nature of those individuals. I mean, there's certainly a striking resemblance
and
here.
parallel.
Yes, yes, that needs to be to be considered in a parallel narrative. So why the big issue with a black artist who killed a sex worker, and the big discussion has to be had, and should we take his painting down or should we not take his painting down? But on the other hand, let's keep Rhodes' statue going, or let's continue with names that have a problematic history or association. So I mean, there's so much that one has to, yes.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Because for me, in any case, there's also the question of the disparities, right? So Zwelethwa Mthethwa's work inspired incredible disgust and outrage in society, necessarily so, right? Necessarily so. We cannot condone violence in any form in society.
No, of course.
However, the very same people that were calling for this painting to be taken down, when you do this work of saying, okay, well, let's take Zwelethwa Mthethwa's work down, but let's also change the street names, let's take down the statues, let's change the names of institutions.
Or the libraries.
Yes,
or bring in other diverse...
Those very same people who were saying, you cannot have this painting here, those people go mum when you say change roads, take the statue down. And again, it just goes to show for me, in many respects, the kind of power and the arrogance exhibited by certain people within the society. An arrogance that demands that we be treated differently. For what purpose? Under what social, economic framework should we allow for certain individuals to be treated differently? And these are the people who are going to be the first people to object when a black body is found wanting of this, that and the other thing.
Yes, it's like always putting the black body under a microscope or zooming in.
Precisely.
And you fade everything else.
Absolutely. And in fact, not even fade, but you
pretend it doesn't exist.
Precisely. Because in many instances, whiteness is invisible.
Yes.
Right? So you invisibilize your own genocidal tendencies, you invisibilize your own crimes against humanity, and of course we've seen this.
And yet this is all triggers.
Precisely.
These are the triggers that generate the negative consequences in everything else and in other issues.
Precisely. So I think in many respects what you're suggesting to us, Quraysha, is that we've got a lot of work to do as this webinar series, in the sense of unearthing the nuances and the textures of some of the problems that we are faced with within society.
So, okay, so the third one was on the creative expression, right? And what's the fourth one?
So the final and fourth one, we are trying, in fact, to reach out to colleagues and experts, legal experts in Pakistan, in Iran, in India, as well as here at home in the South African context. We don't yet have a panel that we've put together, but what we're trying to do is that we're trying to ask legal minds whether or not we have been exceptionally reductionist in our conception of femicide, or if we've been exceptionally generous in our conception of genocide, right? Because again, the idea is to say that the idea is to say femicide is a genocide against women, and what we want legal experts' opinions on is whether or not, because in other contexts, by the way, you have the crime of femicide, legally encoded in the penal code of a country, right? So, for instance, in countries, in contexts like such as Chile, right, you have it legally encoded to say, if you've been convicted, these are the crime, these are the consequences or the penalties that one will face. So we're trying to find out from legal experts in the final segment, as we round up the discussions in September, we're trying to find out whether or not we have been too generous or we have been too limited in our thinking and understanding around femicide in this country.
This is an important discussion and an important conceptualization, because ultimately it contributes towards, I think, a movement that can push for policy changes.
Precisely.
And encoding it into the law.
Precisely.
Because at some point the law has to come into effect in order to stem this behavior and to make it more problematic for people who even contemplate it.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do as we round off the webinar series. What we're trying to do is we're trying to say, how then do we take this discussion that we've been having virtually and translate it into policy, translate it into further research, maybe in terms of fundraising for driving research, and we're still at the moment, in any case, conceptualizing a project in that particular instances as the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, to say how do we move from just having conversations to developing research that scaffolds and in many respects supports the policy objectives and policy revisions that we are calling for as a country in the face of the scourge of gender-based violence in the country.
Okay, so we're left with very little time, and I just want to touch very quickly with COVID-19, the environment, the space, the moment, the event that we are in. And we see the state reacting violently towards some of its citizens. You know, there's a big question about democracy, democratic rights, authoritarianism. Is the state become more authoritarian? Are we losing? Is there an erosion of our democratic rights, of the democratic culture? But the quick question for me is, really speaking, is, was South Africa really a democracy?
Long and short, no. We have democratic institutions in the sense of
procedural democracy.
Yes, absolutely. We vote every 5 years. We do this, we do that, we do the other thing. But who actually gets to participate in the substantive democratic process in this country? It's people who have money. It's people who have elite education. And in many instances, that is confined to a very limited few within our society. People who, in many respects, have always enjoyed particular liberties and rights. The vast majority
always enjoyed a so-called democracy. I mean, apartheid South Africa was democratic.
Absolutely, to a certain few,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly.
So in many respects, we're still seeing that. And the older I get, Quraysha, the more and more critical I am becoming of this black government that has, for nearly 3 decades, kept its heel at the throats of black people in our country.
It certainly is about annealing of black people, eh? It's a continuation. How would you like to end this conversation today? But of course, leave it in such a way that it opens up the possibilities for more, yes.
I'd like to invite our viewers at home and our people to really think and apply themselves critically to what it means to live in a democracy, right? What are the values of a democracy? And how do we espouse those values at home, in our families, in our communities, in our broader national community as a country? How do we espouse those values, and what do they mean for us? And where do we begin to initiate communal discussions about a return or a development of those values that we want to see as democracy in our country?
It should also be, I think so, about recognizing our own and locally first. So a recognition of Colin's cause before we jumped on the bandwagon of George Floyd, right?
Absolutely.
Recognize the humanity of the Africans that are at home. Recognize the humanity of the Africans who are our neighbors. So the shift again, the xenophobia, Afrophobia discussion, you know, why was there no outcry from South Africans when it was happening here, but now we want to scream about George Floyd and what's happening to Afro-Americans. Recognize what we have in front of us first, and that would mean recognizing within the family context what a family is, our interpersonal relationships, and the humanity of those who are closest to us first. If we can't see this, it doesn't make sense that we keep looking that side.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, as a last remark from my side, in any case, it's to suggest that in many instances this is a continuation of the historical narrative, which was always that anything good and anything useful always comes from outside, because again, the violence of colonialism and coloniality has suggested to us that blackness is worthless in our context.
And with that, we have to say that this is the ideal time to break that narrative,
Absolutely.
to break that mindset, to unshackle ourselves and to discover our own inner humanity and goodness. And I hope we can get this, Siseko. But thank you for sharing this time. We're running really out of time. So till we see you again next week, fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.